This talk on rioting and revolutionary ideology is an attempt to examine some of the deep social divisions in our society. I want to look at the underlying ideologies, the ideas that are driving much of the violence that's playing out in our streets. And also to examine the question, why has the normalization of violence become one of the most characteristic features of our time? And what I mean by that is that mob violence following these lockdowns and the stress that that has caused is not all that surprising. It's nothing new in history. But what I found especially disturbing and somewhat surprising was not the rioting and looting that was occasioned by this horrible crime, but the fact that most of our elites were acting as apologists for this violence. They were supportive of the non-peaceful protesters. And of course, we have to acknowledge that initially, especially, many peaceful protesters marching in the tradition of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent resistance were very quickly overshadowed by those who saw violence not just as an acceptable, but actually as a necessary tool in the struggle for racial justice. But if you've gotten the sense more recently that much of what we're seeing playing out in our city streets has very little to do with racism or racial justice, then you're not alone. It's just one example of the elite apologists for violence. We can cite the Attorney General of Massachusetts, who told a gathering of business leaders, quote, "Yes, America is burning, but this is how forests grow." The riots are a kind of Pentecost of a new future, a sort of baptism by fire, don't you see? We can hear echoes in this remark of Robespierre's famous quip, "You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs," or Vladimir Lenin's remark that if you're going to chop down a forest, splinters will fly. The apologists want us to sympathize with the motives of the rioters, which is fair enough. I'm a psychiatrist, and I spend most of my day trying to understand people's motivations and their behaviors. But the notion of to understand all is to forgive all is not really a humanitarian principle. The claim that whoever smashed and looted and set fires could not have done otherwise is not really sympathetic. It's dehumanizing. And it's dehumanizing precisely because it robs these people of that which makes them human, which is the ability to take moral responsibility for their actions instead of merely acting on animal instinct. So the real revolution, I would suggest, would involve restoring the humanity of the rioters precisely by holding them responsible for the wanton destruction and violence that they caused. The elevation of violence, the kind of commentary that we've seen in the news media, in much of the media, and among intellectuals, this follows from the Marxist ideology, the 19th century ideology of the total revolution. Always singular, always capitalized. So it's useful for us to draw a distinction between ordinary political revolutions and the total revolution in the Marxist sense. In an ordinary political revolution, the revolutionaries seek to replace one ruling class with another ruling class. They do not make an attempt to justify any and every form of violence. They make an argument to justify the minimal necessary use of force, but their project isn't merely to just deconstruct everything around them. It's an attempt to construct something positive on a new foundation. A good example of sort of ordinary political revolutions would be the American Revolutionary War, which attempted to justify its aims and argue for the use of force in the public Declaration of Independence. We would rightly judge the American Revolutionaries as hypocrites if they would have carried out their revolution in the name of unalienable rights using any and every means available, engaging in indiscriminate violence or desecration. Had they, for example, tortured and killed British prisoners of war, cutting up their dead bodies and feeding them to animals or something like that. By contrast, the ideology of total revolution knows no inherent limits. Violence isn't just accepted as a necessary evil, as a kind of tragic necessity. It is embraced and ennobled as a kind of positive creative force. Recall the remark, yes, America is burning, but that's how forests grow. So total revolution is an attempt to completely break from the past in order to usher in a totally new future. The goal is to erase the adversary entirely so that nothing of the old world, not even its memory, remains. This is the origin of what's now been dubbed the cancel culture, where attempts to erase people publicly, attempts to entirely topple their reputation, the toppling of statues and other symbols, is also an example of this. This kind of anarchy and nihilism are not only justified, they're actually required by this ideology of total revolution. Because what is attempted is a transition from an old order that is supposedly characterized exclusively by oppression to a totally new order that is so above and beyond us that we can barely describe it. It's interesting to note that Marx very rarely attempted to describe in his writings what the communist utopia would actually look like, because it was a kind of eschatological dream. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard what the utopian future holds. This kind of revolution cannot be carried out under the banner of traditional ethical principles. It cannot be justified on the basis of notions like peace or freedom or justice or love. And the reason is those principles belong to the old order that we are trying to topple. These words, therefore, are merely empty slogans to justify the existing oppressive order. So I want to talk about 5 features and 5 outcomes of this kind of ideology. Number 1, once ethics disappears, violence inevitably follows. What happens to people in this kind of program? What happens is that individuals are instrumentalized. The rights of concrete, present, real people are sacrificed to the rights of an abstract future humanity that is not yet here. So other people are either useful and therefore are deployed as part of the revolution, or they're judged to be useless and therefore discarded. Instead of being guided by individuals, individuals are used by the revolution. This is, for example, why Lenin described the Western intellectuals who are sympathetic to communism as useful idiots. You see the kind of regard that he had even for his allies. Second feature is that ethics becomes entirely absorbed into politics, and politics becomes total war. This process is based on faith, and that's precisely the right word, a kind of faith in the inevitability of historical progress, a kind of axiomatic conviction that history is marching toward a better future, maybe contrary to all actual appearances. To be ethical, therefore, is simply to embrace the direction of history. One doesn't want to end up, quote, on the wrong side of history. And thus, every sin boils down to a sin against the direction of history. Either you get on board the train and you are with the good people, or you don't, and you need to be crushed or overcome or erased or discarded. In this kind of system, and this is the third feature, politics replaces religion as the vehicle for human liberation. This requires the premise of atheistic materialism. It requires the traditional, a rejection of the traditional notion of divine providence. The old idea of the divine governance of the world and of history is replaced by the idea of the complete human governance of the world. Fourth feature, if order, social order, public order, is merely a thin veneer or justification for oppression, then it too is an abomination. It too is something to be eliminated. Social order is not good. It's part of the oppressive system that we need to take down. Order in this framework, in this context, can only be interpreted as hostile and tyrannical. Interestingly, this is kind of a revival of the ancient Gnostic religions, which understood the world to be created not by one God, but by two opposing principles, a sort of good God who created the spiritual world and an evil God who created the material world. This is very far from the Christian conception. God and Satan are not on the same level in Christianity. Of course, Satan is a creature, fallen angel. And the material world, just like the spiritual world, was created by a good God. So natural laws or the natural moral law is not oppressive. It is liberating. Fifth feature, total revolution, therefore, is not just a political struggle. It's a kind of cosmic struggle, an effort to completely recreate all of humanity, to completely recreate even human nature itself. The kind of wholesale rejection and desecration, the total rebellion against the established order, are justified in the name of liberating humanity from an oppressive world. So we can scratch our heads and wonder, why are they toppling statues of abolitionists? Why are they toppling statues of people that helped bring down the institution of chattel slavery in the United States? Well, again, if the total revolution is not just about race, but it's about erasing the past, this begins to make a kind of sense. There's a kind of perverse logic going on here. Just a few remarks on some of the historical and philosophical roots of this ideology. The idea of total revolution begins to take shape during the Enlightenment, especially in the writings of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But it comes to its complete and full and unsurpassable expression in the 19th century philosophy of Karl Marx. And I'm not just talking about Marx's economic system, I'm talking about his metaphysics, his philosophical system of total revolution. Historically, the French Revolution functions as a kind of symbol, although the French Revolution is seen by ideologists as an unfinished revolution. So the total revolution marches, as it were, under the banner of the unfinished business of 1789. You may have seen on television images of Target shopping carts piled up like barricades in Minneapolis when the riots first began to break out. Right? The symbolism here is rather unmistakable. To ultimately triumph, total revolution must be capable of transforming not just the external world, but transforming human nature itself. It amounts, in the end, to a radical attempt to deny human nature, to deny inherent human limitations. But as a friend of mine likes to say, human nature, noble, certainly, but also fragile and mortal and wounded by sin, human nature always bats in the bottom of the ninth inning. Which means that when the revolution encounters human beings, such as we are and such as we'll always be, it comes to a screeching halt. There is no earthly utopia on the far side of this indiscriminate violence. The revolutionaries discover that they are capable of tearing down, but they are not capable of building up. Another way of putting this is that pure force can never produce justice. So when its utopian dream collapses, as it inevitably will when the revolution encounters human nature and human beings, all that remains is nihilism. All that remains is negation. The revolution succeeds only in terms of destroying or desecrating, denying, deconstructing, devaluing, but without having anything positive with which to replace the old order. So the revolutionary rioter ends up looking a lot like the character of the Joker in the movie The Dark Knight. In the film, the Joker responds to a question about his goals and his aims by saying, quote, "Do I really look like a guy with a plan? You know what I am? I'm like a dog chasing cars. I wouldn't know what to do if I caught it." Misbegotten revolutions not only fail to produce their stated aims, they unfailingly and inevitably produce exactly the opposite. This is because they succeed only in tearing down traditional morality based on eternally valid moral principles. And this morality was one of the only things serving as a kind of constraint upon our affluent, consumerist culture. So what ends up happening is that this revolutionary violence, instead of replacing one regime or one ruling class with another, actually permits today's elites to solidify and cement their power within the existing social order. Total revolution serves only to strengthen the most toxic aspects of the existing society that the revolutionaries wanted to overthrow. The elites, therefore, are happy to support this. It's no wonder that corporations have thrown their weight behind the rhetoric of the revolutionary rioters. Karl Marx famously said that religion was the opiate of the people. On the contrary, I would suggest that this kind of revolutionary ideology is the opiate of the people. It's a kind of tonic that our elites are happy to dispense to the masses. In closing, I'd like to ask the question, why has this ideology appeared so attractive to many people, but especially to many young people today? I would suggest that the reason is that this ideology lures many people precisely because it speaks to deep human needs. It's a kind of secular religion that promises deliverance without sacrifice, but deliverance from oppression. It even comes with its own public liturgies. Watch some of the dances and other rituals of the people marching in the streets. This ideology holds out the hope, albeit an illusory and false hope, that the redemption that mankind restlessly seeks is actually imminently available in our time, in our place, just over the horizon of the future. The fact that total revolution always fails to deliver doesn't eradicate these longings from the human heart. The only revolution that will actually land where it aims, that will actually achieve what it seeks, is the one that starts from the right premise. And the right premise in this case has to be the equal dignity and unsurpassable worth of every individual, such that no individual can ever be used as a means to another end. This kind of revolution will therefore disavow forms of indiscriminate or wanton desecration, destruction, or violence. This premise is grounded in the conviction that every human person participates in the same transcendent logos, which is an idea that goes back in Western philosophy all the way to Plato, Aristotle. It is Christianized and elevated in the philosophy of Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Antonio Rosmini in the 19th century. In Christian terms, we would say that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. This is what establishes our shared humanity, our equality, our shared rationality, our ability to deliberate together, to distinguish the good aspects from the bad aspects of our history. One interesting upshot of this analysis is that rather than the standard left, right, liberal, conservative, reactionary, progressive political categories, I suggest that the real political divide today is between what we could call the perfectists and the anti-perfectists, or the non-perfectists. The perfectists would be anyone who believes in the possibility of complete human liberation through politics. And we can actually find perfectists both on the left and the right on the political spectrum today, although those on the left are probably more prone to this mistake. Anti-perfectists or non-perfectists regard this notion of complete liberation through politics as a perennial delusion, as something, as a mistake that's grounded in a denial of basic facts about human nature. Perfectism is ultimately based on an unproven denial of the doctrine of original sin. The Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn described this best. He learned a hard lesson while lying on his bed of straw in the gulags after suffering years of unjust imprisonment at the hands of the communist regime. Now, in these circumstances, it would have been the easiest thing in the world for Solzhenitsyn to see his oppressors, right, the Soviet regime, the prison guards, as the bad guys, and the victims, me, my fellow prisoners, as the good guys. But his relentless examination of conscience went deeper than this. He wanted to understand even his own contributions to the evil in the world. And I'll conclude with his own description of the discovery he made. If only it were all so simple, he writes. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But he goes on to say, gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through the center of every human heart and through all human hearts. And he asks, who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? The human heart. I would suggest to you that the revolution we really need will have to begin there. Thank you.